I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
How you doing?
I'm lovely. It's a great day here in Chicago. It's a little bit rainy, but nice and warm.
So, Dr. Hughes and I are in different parts of the country as Dr. Hughes is visiting with his newly born granddaughter. So, congratulations again, sir.
Yes, Rose Arabella Greenberg Hughes is a lovely little sleepy worm.
Wow, that's great. I'm of the age where I could only remember two of those names at a time. But since you're completely enhanced, I'm sure that you can remember all of them.
Yes, I'm doing fine so far.
Excellent. So we are talking about Ozempic and its friends today, GLP-1 drugs.
Yes, and I, full disclosure, I've been on them for a year and a half and greatly enjoy them. So I'll also bring in some of my personal experience. Have recommended them to others that have had less salubrious experiences, and we'll talk about that too.
Excellent. And since you say that, if you don't mind my asking, why are you on them?
I had wanted to get on them for a long time once they started to show their efficacy in broad terms back in 2023, I think, was when I first started to talk to my doctor about them. In terms of having a prescription for them, which will be the first thing we should address, whether you need a prescription for them, I would have argued on my own behalf that as a preventive weight loss measure, they were a good thing to do. And then a year and a half ago, I did get diagnosed with diabetes. So on my wife's health plan in Connecticut, I get Mounjaro shots free. And I also get a continuous glucose monitor, which is also expensive. So excellent health care coverage through the state plan, but not everybody is so lucky.
And I guess I take it, and we'll get into that more systematically, that the diabetes case is the least controversial case because that's the original indication of the drug. So everyone who has diabetes can pretty much get a prescription for it, right?
Yes. And they have been approved by the FDA also for obesity, of severe obesity. But
I'm just saying they were originally So let's get into the history. So the compound is a naturally occurring one, and I take it that it was synthesized originally by the Danish company that makes Ozempic to counter diabetes. So do we want to say a little bit more on the history of how it moved from a sort of a very specific anti-diabetes drug to this kind of wonder drug status that it has now?
Well, I think when it started to be used back in the 90s, semaglutide in particular, people began to also see the dramatic weight loss that diabetes patients were experiencing with it. It reduces it slows the passage of food from your stomach and through your colon, so you feel satiety longer. That's one of the immediate effects. But it also seems to have an effect on dopamine and the blood-brain connection, and we'll talk about that as well, the fact that it seems to soften addictive noise in the brain, or the noise of desire.
Yeah. So it's originally developed by Novo Nordisk as a diabetes drug. They see that it has weight loss benefits as they begin sort of putting it into circulation. And then they start sort of changing the formulation so that kind of affect the weight loss impact and also the convenience of taking it, right? So that it moves from a daily shot ultimately to a weekly shot. And as that happens, it gets taken up first by celebrities for weight loss. That's how it kind of gets its social media presence initially.
Taking it off label was very expensive, still is relatively expensive. So so it first required substantial expendable income or great amount of desire to spend $1,000 a month.
Yeah.
Semaglutide or tirzepatide. I'm actually on a formulation called tirzepatide, which is two different things, and then there's now orforglipron, which is going to be coming to the market very shortly. And one of the problems of the cost, and this makes it less accessible for people and also changes your kind of risk-benefit profile, is that it's principally a shot at this point. The oral medications were less accessible. But now there's orforglipron, which is going to come out on the market hopefully soon, and it's equally effective as the shots, and it's oral.
So they're being formulated into pills, and the research says that it's pretty much the same efficacy so far.
This new formulation is as efficacious for weight loss as the tirzepatide shots that I take.
Yeah. All right. So in terms of the excitement,
and I've lost 40 pounds, by the way,
and you've lost 40 pounds, which, you know, as your concerned Jewish uncle, I can say you look too skinny, Jay. But
but that's because we live in the United States. I'm actually, my BMI, which I know you're going to contest the utility of BMI, and rightly so.
Yeah.
But my BMI is still slightly overweight. 75% of American men are above the recommended normal.
Yeah. I mean, we might as well say that any metric that can say that now you are overweight is a stupid metric. The BMI is too rough of a way of looking at things, if that's the case. But that's not very controversial.
It's not. My wife agrees with you, but I think one of the questions here is if we can demonstrate that being in a normal BMI is actually ideal for health. And actually, I'm right at that.
We should just say what BMI is, by the way.
Body mass index. It's the ratio of your body weight to your height, which is imperfect because BMI should also be measuring things like the amount of fat in your body. There are more sophisticated measures of obesity. But as a rough measure, BMI for me would be about roughly 160 pounds for my height is over the line at which I become overweight. And I'm like 163 now. But it turns out that if you look at the relationship of BMI for older men to life expectancy, being a little bit overweight is actually the ideal, but it's a very complicated picture because if you're dying of something, usually you're losing weight as well. And so there's all kinds of things that can go on with the relationship between health and weight.
Yeah. Let's backtrack a little bit and kind of do our usual sort of minimizing of disagreement, because I think that kind of makes the discussion more interesting. So it would be crazy to raise any objections to this drug for the diabetes use case. It seems like in a context where we didn't have a ton of super useful long-term ways to address that disease, this is great.
Yes. Well, I think the first policy question, as is often the case in our debates, is, are you just offering shitty life coach advice? Suck it up, maggot, get on your diet and don't take pills.
Or I will, but wait. Of course I will.
Or are you trying to advise this now Maha-controlled anti-therapeutic regime that has these fascists that have taken over our health administration to say nobody should be taking a pill when they could be out there jogging around the block? And it's like, well, so the first question here is, should there be prescriptive control of these things or not? And there are a lot of things that we should have prescriptive control over that we don't, like Tylenol. One bottle of Tylenol taken incorrectly can kill you. And in Europe, it's a controlled substance, and it's not in the United States. So we have some irrationality there. Alcohol, the most dangerous psychoactive substance in the United States. Marijuana is still treated like it's a felony, and it's not at all as dangerous. So we have a lot of irrationality and prescriptive control of substances and in general. The second is, if you allow people to take something over the counter, and then should it also be subsidized by the state? When should the state or a private health insurance subsidize something? And so the treatment therapy distinction here, the treatment enhancement distinction is behind it is the question of what should we be allowing in the first place and what should we be subsidizing?
Well, but again, I see no, assuming that it is subject to prescription, I see no issue for its use in diabetes, and I see no use in its use for clear cases of obesity. And
so morbid obesity.
Morbid obesity. So forget for a moment about the BMI as an indicator because it's, unreliable. But some cases of morbid obesity, I see no issue whatsoever. I think the questions both about, and I'm assuming there it would still be subject to prescriptions, but the prescription, just like in your diabetic case, would be pretty automatic. I think the more, because the data is pretty good about weight loss and the connection between weight loss and health outcomes for those cases. Where it seems
we should also say that the sequelae from this also include not just reduced risk from diabetes, reduced cardiovascular risk, probably reduced cancer risk, certainly reduced stroke, and probably extended life expectancy. Behind this also is the question of when do we subsidize or expand access to preventive therapy? If I had gotten on this 10 years ago, I wouldn't have become diabetic. And so, the risk-benefit ratio was not there 10 years ago for doctors to make this accessible to me. But now I think you can make a strong argument that anybody who's overweight and is worried about the effect of weight on their health, as they should be, could get this as a preventive health measure.
Yeah. So in terms of one of the reasons why we decided to talk about this, which is a bit of a departure from some of the kind of things that we often talk about, is the scope of people taking it is incredible, right? So right now, every 8th American is on a GLP-1 drug. And at least according to existing definitions, close to, a third of Americans are obese, 100 million people?
Depending on how you look at it, yeah. The majority of Americans are obese, according to the BMI. The majority of American adults.
Yeah. So the number I saw was about a third, which I guess, so maybe it's just a different definition of obesity. But even if we go with that lower figure, that's an incredible number of people potentially. It's already 1 of every 8 Americans taking this drug is an incredible number of people taking a brand new drug, the long-term consequences of which are unclear. There's the protective benefits of weight loss and potentially the protective benefits of improved heart disease, etc. Maybe even protective brain benefits for different kinds of dementia, but there's stuff that we don't know. There's some reports of pretty wide-scale ahedonia, the loss of desire in general. So I guess one question is, does it worry you that an eighth of the population is taking a drug that has the effects of which have not been tested for a long time?
Well, we do have substantial evidence of their efficacy and their side effects. And in fact, about half of the people who start them stop them within a year because of the side effects. There are substantial side effects. Principally nausea, because it changes the passage of food in your body, and sulfur burps and, various kinds of gastrointestinal complaints, diarrhea. And so, for instance, members of my family that have gotten to try them have stopped them because of these side effects. So yeah, I think that's a self-limiting feature of the current set of drugs, and hopefully there are other drugs that are in the pipeline, and we'll be able to improve the efficacy and reduce the risk. Yeah. But does it worry me that the principal thing that is driving down American life expectancy, which is the rise of obesity, and globally driving down life expectancy, that we now have an effective treatment for it? No, it doesn't worry me at all. I think, a lot of people need these drugs.
Yeah. Not all kinds of obesity are driving down American life expectancy, though. And on the assumption that the side effects are going to be handled, which I think they probably will, because there's a huge economic incentive to improve them. Here comes, essentially what you might call stoicism in a pill, right? Forget about attempts at self-control. You're going to get the pill that makes it unnecessary. Now, I actually, to your surprise, I'm not going to make shitty life coach advice that you were thinking about. I do want to suggest an analogy to you and see what you think to antidepressants. I think antidepressants are amazing and are lifesavers. I think, and they're not great in terms of their efficacy. Their side effect profile is very problematic across the board. They don't work for everyone. They're the best thing that we have, and there's a mental health epidemic, so God bless the fact that we have them, but they're far from perfect. My sense is, and it's not only my sense, this is backed up by research, the best case for antidepressants is when they are used as adjuncts to to allow people to acquire the sort of psychological skills to make different choices, become more insightful, control their anxiety, etc. The reality is, though, that once there's a pill that allows people to feel better, people just take the pill without the life choice adjunct. I think the same exact thing is going to happen with GLP-1s. Namely, this could be an amazing adjunct to motivate people to exercise more, eat more healthily, eat less, etc., eat less processed foods if they can afford to. What's probably going to happen is people are just going to take the GLP-1s because the rest is harder and requires more work. That I do have a problem with, and you seem not to.
Well, the first thing to say is that although I'm skeptical of the alleged efficacy of counseling and therapy, but we won't go into that in this.
That's a separate episode.
Yeah. I am more open to the efficacy of therapy relative to psychoactive drugs, antidepressants, than I am to the recommendation of exercise and diet as an approach to weight management and reducing diabetes risk, because 95% of all diets fail and exercise doesn't help with weight loss at all. Exercise can help with...
help some people and doesn't help others. There's a huge genetic component.
Well, there is a huge genetic component, but in general, exercise is orthogonal to, is not correlated with substantial weight loss, because you can't exercise the weight enough to get the weight off. And I've tried. I spent a whole year doing like 2 hours of exercise a day. And yes, I lost weight, but it was because every mouthful of food then is a calculation in your head. This is another 10 minutes on the elliptical. But so, yes.
But you're probably a lot healthier by virtue of doing that anyway.
Exercise is great. And in fact, we are going to also soon have exercise mimics, pills that actually do the same thing for your body.
There's our next episode.
Right. The exercise mimics will do the same thing for your body that exercise would have otherwise done. And for a lot of people, since the vast majority of people know that they should exercise and do not exercise, I think that this is also in the same category as
somebody should throw the exercise mimic at them and make them run away. And that will be their exercise.
Another thing to say about the antidepressant parallel is that I don't think there's any evidence or anyone advocating that you should start taking antidepressants as a preventive measure for inevitable depression, right?
That's right.
But in this particular case, as we get older, the vast majority of Americans, at least, become obese and the risks of diabetes and diabetes-related outcomes and heart disease and other things that are sequelae of obesity do come online. And so if you have any propensity towards obesity in your family, there's a strong argument for preventive use of these drugs. So I don't think that the analogy works very well. But even if it did...
It's an imperfect analogy.
Yeah.
Look, the analogy just rests on this question of what matters. Is it only that your metrics improve, namely that your lipid panel is better, that your weight is better, that your different cholesterol numbers are better? Or does it also matter that you live as much as you can an active, self-directed, self-controlled life where you feel that you are in charge? And weight and mood are two areas, I think, where that question comes up. And I think the temptation here, which you do not seem impressed by, is that since you're so excited about the new exercise implements that are going to vibrate one's muscle instead of yourself.
Not even that, just take a pill. But yeah.
Yeah. So that's a terrible idea. Why not use these, and you could implement policy approaches that do that. Why not use the GLP-1s and the antidepressants as part of a program that emphasizes, encourages, and nudges self-control, self-direction, an active lifestyle, a lifestyle in which you own and take charge of your mental and physical health?
Let me say that behind this, I think there's also my anxiety about how classist the discussion is, because both mental health and obesity are correlated with class. And to say to someone, you know what you really need is to get yourself a physical trainer and start eating different foods and shopping at Whole Foods instead of buying potato chips at the grocery market. Yeah, maybe all of that's good advice for middle class people, and it's the kind of middle class condescension to working class and poor problems.
Dude, you're the big social democrat who always believes in policy solutions. So part of the policy solution should be, as you know, that I believe that some of this stuff should be subsidized. But your belief is just giving like the perfect carte blanche to the neoliberals to not do any of that because they're throwing, the fucking pill at people and say, here, eat your pill and keep going to Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Look, yes, there is the problem of the technofix. The technofix idea, which often comes up for us, is if we have a good technical solution to a particular problem, does it reduce the motivation to have the additional and complementary and also necessary social fixes? In this case, we need social fixes as well. There are food deserts that make it more difficult for poor people to get access to high quality produce, et cetera. But actually, the explanation of not having access to the right kinds of food is not a great explanation for working class poverty. The sense of powerlessness that poor people experience is more endemic, I think, and behind the mental health issues as well. So I think we need a more equal society. A more equal society, as we see in social democratic countries, more equal societies are also healthier countries for a variety of reasons. And I want all of those solutions as well. And yes, it should be part of it. But is there some causative relationship between saying, so for instance, the classic case is airbags. Did people start driving less safe when they had airbags? Yes, they in fact started to drive faster. Does that make airbags a bad idea? We should not have had airbags so that people realize that if they get in an accident at 50 miles an hour, they're going to die instead of at 80 miles an hour. No, we still need airbag, right?
Yeah.
So the argument about the technofix is never don't have the technofix. It's always also have the social solution.
Yeah. How do you prioritize and allocate between them?
Well, in this case, all preventive investments, and this gets into the quality adjusted life year. How do we think about how to make allocation decisions with the public dollar in general, and specifically for the public dollar that we've invested in healthcare? The quality adjusted life year, I think, is the ideal consequentialist metric. It says we're going to calculate how many, for each intervention that we can do, we're going to calculate how many life years we're going to add to people in society and the quality of those life years. And we're going to figure out the cost bang for buck for each dollar that we spend on each intervention. And then we're going to figure out on the basis of that how we can maximize the quality and life years of the population. And preventive medicine is always at the top, right? That's why vaccines are always at the top, because if you can keep a kid from, keep somebody from getting shingles when they're older by 1 penny shot when they're 1, then of course, everyone agrees we should do that. And this is a preventive therapy.
Yeah. Let me ask the question from a different angle. If you say that the amount of, food noise that one has in their head, namely the amount to which, they are preoccupied by food or have intrusive thoughts about food, which I'm assuming is largely genetically modulated, or the amount of anxiety that they have, again, is hugely genetically determined. If you medicalize this completely, which we are in the habit of doing, and also makes sense of then prescribing a pill for it. On the one hand, I think that's an amazing achievement because it reduces stigma, as we have done with addiction, and and as we have done with the health, and as we, I'm assuming, are in the process of doing with weight questions and obesity, and I think that's great. And on the other hand, it ignores the fact we talked about this a little bit in some previous previous meetings, it ignores the fact that there's a difference between, lung cancer or other kinds of diseases and these conditions. These are conditions, namely the food question, the mental health question. These are the addiction questions. These are diseases where will has a bigger weight than some of the other ones. So my will, self-development, agency, my worry is that we are prematurely sort of deleting agency and the sort of self-control questions from this context.
I completely disagree, because on the grounds of moral enhancement, some people need to quiet the noise of addiction in their head just to get started with their life project. And so on those grounds, it's like, yeah, Buddhism is intended to address the problem of suffering. But does that mean you shouldn't take antidepressants? No, because if you're depressed enough, you can't do anything, right?
That's right.
Taking an antidepressant can get you at least to the point where you can start exercising and dieting and doing all the other things.
But then I take it that you agree with my earlier point. The best way to conceptualize a GLP-1 or an antidepressant, even though you don't like the analogy in this context, is as an enabler to a self-determination project, a self-involved project, a project where there's self-direction.
Then there's the question of the efficacy of the advice. Doctors have been advising people to diet and exercise more for how long? Forever? And how effective is it? 95% not effective? Oh, and most doctors eventually give up because they realize it's completely ineffective.
95% not effective only if your exclusive metric is weight loss.
It's 95. It's effective to pat yourself on the back briefly until you put, start using your elliptical as a clothes hanger. So look, GLP-1s.
It improves your cardiovascular capacity, which improves your mood, which improves.
I exercise every day. Everyone should exercise every day. Yes, we all agree. You know what makes it really hard to exercise every day is being very obese. It makes it much more difficult.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the moral enhancement question. GLP-1s reduce the incidence of smoking cigarettes. They reduce the noise from alcohol and substance abuse.
Yeah.
And they're now being experimented with as adjuvant therapies for people with addictive disorders. So in general, this is a Buddhist drug. This is a drug that reduces the power of desire and addiction over your life. And to the extent that it does that, I think it's a perfect example of the kind of moral enhancement I've been looking for.
Yeah. So let me put a pin in that for a second and just say, in your world, you take a pill to want to eat less and gamble less. You take another pill to mimic the impacts of exercise. You take a third pill to modulate your mood. You take a fourth pill to become more sympathetic and empathetic and morally enhanced. And then why not just plug yourself into some kind of experience machine? Take whatever color. What color was it? Red pill, blue pill? I forget. And just be done with it.
I'm willing to talk about that as well. But look, let's go back to the reality. Currently, half of the people who try these don't tolerate them. So
yeah.
One of the interesting questions...
That's going to get fixed because there's a lot of money in fixing it.
I think that should be fixed. And, it's possible to control diabetes. If you're diagnosed with diabetes, it's theoretically possible to control your diabetes completely through diet and without insulin. Now, a lot of Americans can't afford insulin. We should be expanding access to insulin. And I don't think very many people would argue that we should be denying insulin to people, because if you just ate tofu all day, you wouldn't have this diabetes problem anymore. And it's like, yeah, but I don't want to eat tofu all day. And most of the people with diabetes aren't going to eat tofu all day. So that's why we need insulin, is so that you can have a normal life.
Yeah.
There's another problem here, which is which I think is more trenchant, which is the attitude about fat in our society and the moralization of fat stigma and so forth, which I experienced my whole life and which made me miserable, right? Mm-hmm. I started to gain weight when I was 28 or so after eating too much sushi in Japan, and got up into the morbid obesity category, and then started to do radical diets and tried to get it down, and spent spent many years thinking every day about my weight and about my physical appearance. So it's not, I am not immune to the concerns about fat phobia and its effect on people's mental health. But I'll tell you my current attitude as someone who's benefiting from these drugs and in a society where everyone's now aware of these drugs. When I meet somebody who has morbid obesity or who's very overweight, I no longer suspect them or want to talk to them about why our diets didn't work, and I assume that they are no longer experiencing being seen as a victim of moral failure. Now it's a question of are you in the position, because our healthcare system sucks, where you can't afford these drugs, in which case my deepest sympathies, and I wish our healthcare system didn't suck. 2, have you, like many people, tried these and you can't tolerate them, and so this is not the good therapy for you yet? Or 3, are you making a political statement with your body? Which if you are, God bless you, I'm all for making political statements with your body. But the attitude about fat in our society will change, but it's not that fat becomes more phobic, it's that fat changes its meaning to these other moral valences.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. And I think that shaming people for their weight and shaming people for their propensity for anxiety and depression is absurd. What I am worried about is that your approach goes to the other extreme and completely drains both the public sphere and everyday life from agency. And the truth of the matter is, I mean, first of all, obviously, many diseases have a environmental/behavioral component. But again, addiction is not the same thing as getting prostate cancer. One involves a greater degree of the influence of agency than another. And I worry that you are looking at them in the same kind of way. So should we be shaming overweight people or anxious people? No.
Okay, well, let's stay with prostate cancer for a second. One of the therapies for prostate cancer takes a long time to kill men, and one of the treatments for it is to put radioactive bullets in your prostate. If you have a large prostate, it reduces the growth of the prostate. Should we be denying people access to that preventive? You don't even have cancer yet. You just have an enlarged prostate. Should we be denying men access to this enlarged prostate preventive therapy and saying, how much roughage do you eat? Have you been eating enough roughage? Because that reduces your incidence of prostate cancer. If you haven't, we're going to deny this until you... No, we're not going to say that, right? We're going to say, you can get the preventive therapy and you should eat more roughage.
So for you, the medicalization of anxiety and the medicalization of weight is simply an overdue development, and they're exactly the same as any other kind of medical condition.
We are eventually going to have posthuman bodies, but posthuman bodies where we have control over all the features of our material existence. And in that future, I want everyone to have that access equally. We're all going to have to figure out in that future what the ideal life, what a good life looks like, developing a moral character looks like.
Yeah.
You seem to think that burdening people with untreatable obesity and telling them to suck it up and go exercise. You are. This is what you're advocating. You're saying if you're fat, you just have to go exercise and diet, and we shouldn't be giving you a pill.
No way am I thinking that. I'm just thinking that you should pressure people to supplement their medication regime with a behavioral regime, both because it's better for them and it will make them feel better about themselves, because people get better mental health results from the exercise of agency. I'll give you a very concrete example, policy-wise, of what I think. In the UK, the drugs are covered, GLP-1s are covered for overweight questions, not just for morbid obesity and diabetes, where I think they should be covered full stop, no questions asked. They are covered if you can, as a question of healthcare rationing or allocation or policy, they're covered if you can establish that you are taking taking some behavioral measures. I think that's appropriate.
Do I think every doctor who prescribes these drugs should be talking to their patients about diet and exercise? Absolutely. Because you can get around the effects of these drugs by eating more high-calorie diets. And that's been a long-time problem with stomach staples.
Look, a person like me who's a little bit overweight and wants to get a GLP by BMI, by the way, for whatever BMI is worth. I like telling myself on my better days that I'm not actually overweight. It's just the BMI number. But suppose the BMI is correct.
You do not look overweight to me, but that's
there you go. See, you can be my Jewish uncle. But well, no, actually, you can't. You have to tell me. Anyway,
we're in the time slip here. We're both each other's Jewish uncles.
Exactly. What I am saying is, if a person like me, who's just a little bit overweight, all right, goes to the doctor and says, I want a GLP-1. The UK approach to this, as I understand it, which I like, is to say, okay, show me your gym membership. Okay, let's see some kind of log of activity. And to satisfy your social democratic craving, I would say that in my world, that gym membership should be subsidized, not just the GLP-1. And that, I think, is a much more reasonable approach than what actually happens in American doctors' thing is, you've been depressed for 6 months, just take the SSRI. It's no big deal. And it isn't a big deal, but it's just, it seems irresponsible to just throw a pill at somebody without even thinking about caring the entire sort of set of adjacent behaviors and tendencies that and you just think that you should throw more and more pills at people to cover those adjacent sets of tendencies because one day we'll have posthuman bodies.
I think there's a couple problems with that. One is that it's condescending and counterproductive. It's like the old idea in welfare reform. You should, every time you get your dole check, you should have to attest and show some evidence that you've been looking for a job. It's like, okay, but what if there's no jobs out there? Then it just becomes a ritual, a meaningless ritual. If that's all it is, which it
that's not all that is.
For most doctor visits, when doctors tell their patients you should eat green leafy vegetables and exercise more, it's just a ritual because they know that there's no likelihood that this advice is going to be followed. It's also classist because the advice often, as you point out, in a society that does not yet subsidize the kinds of access to good, healthy food and
but it's not. It doesn't have to be classist. It's not classist by definition.
It's not classist by. It could be not classist in a social
somewhat
democratic
paternalistic
society.
by definition.
It's paternalistic,
which I have zero problem with.
Okay,
people don't always know what's good for them.
I have zero problem with every doctor needing to talk to their patients about diet and exercise. I agree. Completely agree. And as they have been for 60 years.
Not needing to. If you haven't gone to the gym and you're like me, you don't get your GLP-1 drug. If you're like you should get it because you have diabetes.
That's like saying you don't get your insulin unless you can prove you eat tofu every day. I just don't believe that's a good medical thing to do.
I don't need insulin, and you did before you took. So it's not the same thing.
How about you don't get your antidepressant drugs unless you can prove that because exercise is also an effective antidepressant, right? So why don't we deny antidepressant drugs to people who aren't on a exercise?
So deny is a strong solution. I'm just saying you come up with a.
If you're not saying deny, then you're not saying policy. You're just saying shitty life coach advice, which I'm fine with. I'm fine with your shitty life coach advice.
Not shitty life. I mean, look, I think it's okay to have a judgment to say yes. I hope that people who, of course, I think it's better if you are experiencing long-term mental health difficulties to combine medication with therapy. Much better. And research supports it. And I'm sure that in terms of your holistic physical health, it would probably be better it would be better to combine GLP with self-directed measures to improve your health, whatever they are. It would improve your health. It would improve your mood. So I think the outcomes would be better. And it would be a more sophisticated approach than just, solving one problem after another with whatever pill emerges at the moment.
And I completely agree. As I've said, I think it should be standard medical practice to talk to people about diet and exercise, especially as an adjuvant therapy to the drugs, because as I was getting into, you can get around the benefits of these drugs or a stomach staple or a stomach bypass as well by eating more high-calorie foods. And so you need to be talking to people about what kind of diet they go on. And it becomes easier to get on a good diet once you take these drugs. It also becomes easier to exercise once you've lost the weight. The attitude that people have towards diet and exercise will change as a part of these drugs. But to deny people drugs when they need to get to that place is, I think, the problem.
Yeah. So philosophically, in a way, where we stand is your argument is that sort of applying the Aristotelian virtue framework to weight loss is cruel because people can't actually control it. Then I tend to agree. The Aristotelian approach here would be sort of, this is a moral shortcut. You don't get to exercise self-control. If you don't exercise self-control, you don't become self-controlling. And I think that's uninformed. A modified sort of virtue ethics approach is that you use the drugs as an adjunct to your capacity to develop self-control. Because as you said before, sometimes your situation is so dire that you can't even sort of initiate your self-control journey. To some extent, I guess we disagree about which should be an adjunct to which, which is sort of on top of the other in the adjacency relationship, but we can leave it at that for a moment. I do have a question for you about the Buddhism point that you made, and this here, I guess, stems from my misunderstanding of Buddhism. So in what I've read and who I've listened to and talked to, part of my understanding was that the great insight of Buddhism about suffering or about noise in your head is not to extinguish it, but to learn to live with it and change your attitude towards it. Am I wrong?
Yes. No, you're correct. But Buddhism is not opposed to analgesics, for instance, right? Buddhism says, yes, suffering is inevitable in life, but there's no reason to embrace unnecessary suffering or to cause yourself unnecessary suffering. And Buddhism's always been open to the practice of medicine.
Yeah.
There's one of the few personal possessions that monks were allowed to carry with them is medicine. And so Buddhism's not Christian Science. It doesn't say you have to pray the pain away. It says do what you can to alleviate unnecessary suffering, and there's still suffering there, right? That the point of dukkha, of the suffering of Buddhism, is that it is pervasive in all existence. Even if you are a god, any version of heaven still has suffering in it because there's going to be impermanence and unrequited love and et cetera, et cetera. What you need to get to is a place of ordinary suffering that you can live with and start getting ahead with. And for most people with mental health issues and most people with these kinds of biological burdens, that they need a little help to get to the place where they can start moving ahead.
What about, here's a rehashing of my Buddhism question. If you have noise in your head about food, intrusive noise in your head about food. So, I mean, like I heard an interesting Ezra Klein podcast a couple of weeks ago about GLP-1 drugs, and he said that he's kind of always had sort of food noise in his head, that when he's sitting and talking to somebody and there's a plate of cake there, the very existence of the cake takes up, sort of a degree of his attention, which I understood, and certainly felt that there's periods of my life where I was like that too. There can be a degree where the noise, and this is true about psychological intrusive thoughts, foods intrusive thoughts, there can be a degree that the noise is so loud and so overwhelming that you can't do everything else. And I think there it's really important to take a drug or an implement to quiet it down. But there's also...
That's also the case for testosterone suppression for sex offenders. Yes, yeah.
But there's also a sense where at least the best version of Buddhism, I think, would be something like, once it's down to a certain level, tough luck, you have noise in your head about food. So just learn to develop a relationship with the noise in your head, that it's not that important, that it's just an untuned station, or, whatever the metaphor that we like. There seems to be a desire here to turn off the noise in your head, and that seems to me to be both counterproductive and nihilistic.
Well, look, again, there's a difference between life coach advice, which in this case, I would also endorse the idea that everyone should be recommended to practice mindfulness meditation and learn to recognize the symbols, the signals from their body and their brain about things like food noise and to see past them. I have tinnitus, and it was very depressing when I first got tinnitus 20 years ago. But now, because of being able to meditate with it and just see it as yet another one of the many noises in my environment, I think meditation, mindfulness practice has actually helped me live with tinnitus. And I think you can do the same thing with food noise. You can do the same thing with chronic pain, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But should that be the first line that when you go to your general practitioner, he says, well, have you practiced mindfulness meditation for 6 months to learn to see past your chronic pain? Before I give you any analgesics, I'm not going to give you analgesics until you practice mindfulness meditation. No, we don't want that. Right?
I like that.
We want it to be a part of the discussion.
Yeah. See, you dismissed that far too quickly.
State-mandated Buddhism. I'm for state-mandated Buddhism, I guess.
Not state-mandated, but imposing a cost on not taking those 6 months. Actually, yeah, I don't think that's such an absurd idea. At any rate, what about the anhedonia impact? So many people who stop taking the drugs report not only the gastrointestinal side effects, which I'm willing to put good money will go away as the thing gets formulated better, but that along with their desires for food, alcohol, and drugs, their desires, period, have been shut off. If we end up giving this to a third of the population, are we at risk of zombifying ourselves?
We're either entertaining and pleasuring ourselves to death, or we're suffering from anhedonia, drug-assisted anhedonia. It's like, make up your mind. Do you want people to be constantly addicted to everything and, distracted by it? Or do you want people to have the peace of mind where they finally are able to look at their lives and say, what do I actually want to do with my life?
Want to make people do 6 months of meditation. That's what you want.
And if that's one of the long-term results, then God bless the drugs, right? That would be fantastic. But look, anhedonia, as you point out, one of the reasons people quit these drugs is because they're so used to, or they're so addicted to, or however you want to frame it, these pleasures that have been tuned down in their brain that they no longer experience life as pleasurable. And so, yes, they stop taking the drugs. Thank goodness we're not forcing these drugs on people, because they get to choose whether or not the pleasures of their life were worth the balance and the benefits of these drugs. Now, I think people can sometimes too quickly give up on the efficacy of these things because they really enjoyed having that brunch every day with their gal pals and drinking mimosas, and now they don't want to do that anymore. And oh my God, that was the only thing that gave my life meaning. It's like, well, maybe you should be thinking about your life more deeply. So I have my own life coach advice. Think about your life more deeply if you've suddenly discovered that your daily mimosa is the only thing that was giving it meaning.
You're very dismissive of mimosas, which I would
love a daily mimosa myself.
Yeah, me too. But there's a tension there. It's interesting because I was actually thinking about some of the tendencies of our conversations today, and you have you have a tendency to fall back on the sort of basic liberal informed consent commitment, right? That if people have decided that after considering it, that this is, that taking a GLP-1 for themselves, even though they're only slightly overweight, is best for them, and they, that's all they want to do for their health, and, that's fine. And I guess I'm far more open to the possibility across the board that people's informed choices is not and can't be the last word, because people are actually uninformed, even if they have the possibility of being informed, and don't always know what's good for them. Does that make me an authoritarian? Well, more than you, but not necessarily in an illegitimate kind of way.
I am open to the libertarian paternalist argument, or the benevolent paternalist argument, that the state and state expertise can inform public policy in a way that shapes choices that are in the general interest, even when individuals might. So, for instance, the fact that we have prescriptive drug control in the first place, or that we have the Food and Drug Administration in the first place, clinical trials. This is an intervention into people's lives who might otherwise want to take something that they just read about on social media from China. Mm-hmm. And we should say, and we're not saying very often anymore under this accelerationist regime, but we should say, no, the state has determined that before you take these kinds of things, you should know their risks and their benefits, and we're going to put them through trials. And then we're going to decide which ones should be prescribed by doctors and which ones can be sold over the counter. That's all an intervention into people's choices. And I'm fine with those interventions. And the rationales for those interventions is that we want to have the knowledge base to advise people to make informed choices. But that, yes, in a liberal society, we eventually want to get to the place where people could decide, I want to maintain these extra 50 pounds because I don't give a crap about the consequences or whatever the choices are that they're making. Or I want to take these drugs and because I really want to be thin.
Yeah. There's one interesting question that we haven't addressed, which is the presence, do you think the existence of, not that this should decide the policy choice, by the way, before you go there, is the presence of GLP-1 drugs going to further change, complicate, skew our aesthetic norms? Namely, is this going to make being overweight even worse now because people are going to say, why the fuck aren't you taking these drugs? What's wrong with you?
I think it will. And I think that that's pretty much inevitable. I think we also see people making conscious cosmetic choices that previous generations would have considered horrifying, face tattoos and piercings and all kinds of things that some subcultures consider attractive and others don't. But one of the things that we also see historically is that the percentage of people with severe disabilities and disfigurements in our society has gone down because we have fewer industrial accidents, we have fewer men engaged in violent conflict, we have fewer amputees, you can get plastic surgery if you have something on your face that you don't like. And yes, this is changing our aesthetic standards. And in some places we see the extremes of that. We see extreme aestheticization in places like Korea and Brazil, where they have a high incidence of the use of plastic surgery. And I think we can be critical of the other extreme, that there can be over-aestheticized, over-patriarchal, over-classist, discriminatory uses of aesthetic preferences in those societies. But the fact that reducing the incidence of disease and disability in society makes us more aware of people who are suffering from disease and disability, is that an inevitability that I'm willing to accept? I am willing to accept that.
Yeah. The effect may be empathetic, but I guess what I was suggesting is that the effect also may be judgmental, maybe the increase of judgment rather than the destigmatization.
As I said, at least in my personal experience, I don't think I ever looked at obese people and thought, why aren't you doing something about that? Now there is that question. It's like, I hope that they know about these drugs, but I think every obese person is probably being asked every single day, have you heard about these drugs? Have you tried these drugs? So my new assumption with seeing people who are suffering from obesity is that you have either made a conscious choice, in which case, God bless you, or you tried it and it didn't work, or you can't afford it, in which case, screw American healthcare.
Yeah, which we should say there is a not insignificant subset of the population for whom it doesn't work, probably for genetic reasons. A few months ago, we talked about Dario Amadei's piece "Machines of Loving Grace," in which he kind of laid out the optimistic vision for the future of AI, and it was a vision in which vision that you liked very much, in which people came into control of their biology, complete control of their biology, how they look. The interesting thing for me about GLP-1s is, in a way, it's the first sort of hint, real hint, big hint of what that future will look like, because it's has put on our horizon the real possibility that people can control just how much they weigh at will, without the struggle. And you multiply that across different conditions, mental health, height, whatever. You start getting, you squint a little, you start seeing Dario's picture. So I think that's actually an interesting clue there.
I think as we understand aesthetics, there is no one aesthetic, right? Yes, the dominant aesthetic will probably, as we see in places like Brazil and Korea, the dominant aesthetic has become more aesthetically perfect, and the Barbieification of femininity and so forth. And we have to be critical of that and push back against it. But there are also many people whose aesthetic is to reject the dominant aesthetic, right? And so I think there will still be people in the future who say, you know what, I want to look like a tiger. I want to file my teeth into points and have stripes on my body instead of look like your ideal Barbie doll. And God bless them. And God bless the fact that we have aesthetic diversification in our society. Yeah. But do we then deny people the right to be thin and attractive according to whatever standard they've inherited because we don't like that? Now, there is a problem with body dysmorphia. And I do think that body dysmorphia is also something that doctors should talk to patients about, which is that you actually do not need to be doing anything to yourself in order to be attractive. You are already an attractive person. And maybe their LLMs should be telling them that as well, not just their doctor. It's the sycophantic LLM. You are beautiful just the way you are. And that could be a benefit of the LLM.
Yeah. I mean, all of the. I'm just making that as a descriptive observation that this seems to me a step towards the realization of Dario's vision of, sort of complete control of how we look and what our biology is like. It's a step in that direction.
Yeah, it's the posthuman body. We're going to have posthuman bodies.
Yeah, and posthuman bodies, a world with posthuman bodies, the more posthuman our bodies are, the less these unbidden, unchosen features of our biology and psychology remain a source of meaning. And as you know, I think that is not just a gain, but also a loss. But that can be a different topic for a different fight.
I think we hit all the points. The only point that was remaining on my list here was the fact that you can't stop taking them, which a lot of people are worried about. And that may be something that changes in the future too. We may eventually get a shot that's like once a year or, like Depo-Provera as a birth control method.
Well, there's nothing special about GLP-1s in this can't stop taking them feature.
Antidepressants, antipsychotics, they're all in the same category. So I don't think that's a big issue really.
Should we discuss some cultural recommendations? So we wanted to offer something from a different genre today. Both Jay and I are big fans of podcasts. We must always have something in our ear so that we don't think our depressive existential thoughts. And then
that cuts close to home, actually.
and in those in those genres, I actually think increasingly I'm becoming convinced that it's good for you to have nothing in your ear. But if you must, two offerings. One is a podcast. Well, two podcasts that we actually both like a lot. One is Hard Fork, the New York Times tech podcast that has a very fun dynamic duo that kind of walks through the political and policy and technical implications of new developments, very often around the world of AI. It helps both Jay and I stay abreast of what's going on. Funny, smart.
They know everybody and they don't sugarcoat it, and they're very critical of the right thing.
Yeah, so very, very good. Hard Fork is one recommendation. Another, which has absolutely nothing to do with technology, is The Rest is History, which has Dominic Sandbrook and Tom, I'm forgetting his last name, I'll remember in a moment. Two wonderful historians, very, very eclectic, very British as a result, very reverent, and not completely accepting of American political correct pieties, which is refreshing. They're a pleasure to listen to. Jay and I have learned from their repartee quite a bit. There's a huge backlog of episodes there. One very fun entry point is their series, their several series on the French Revolution. There's another on Nixon, another on the U.S. in 1968, another on Great Britain in the 70s. So endless amount, whatever you're interested in, ancient, medieval, or modern history. Really terrific. And
if I started going down all the podcasts that I could recommend, I subscribe to like 150 different podcasts. It's a daily minute task for me to tell it which podcasts I'm actually going to listen to. But
I know you need a large language model just to keep track of that.
Yeah.
All right, sir.
So we will solve future problems in the future.
Future problems for the future. That sounds specific and appropriate. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Prosthetic Gods is hosted by me, Jay Hughes, sociologist, bioethicist, and the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and by Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and director of UMass Boston's Applied Ethics Center. You can find us at prostheticgods.podbean.com. In the words of Sigmund Freud, man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown onto him, and they still give him much trouble at times.